Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Mars Lecture on Business Ethics. This is a signature event of the Ethics, Politics, and Economics major made possible by the generosity of Forrest Mars, who wanted Yale to stand at the forefront of thinking about the importance of ethics in all walks of life, including and perhaps especially in business. And today, to help us elevate our thinking, we're so fortunate to have with us one of the most interesting and significant figures in British politics today. As a member of Parliament for the last 9 years, Rory Stewart has served in ministerial roles, including most recently as Secretary of State for International Development. And perhaps I will leave it at that and let Mr. Stewart tell us about some interesting events about which you probably know, but what happened to his cabinet position when he decided to challenge Mr. Boris Johnson over the Brexit issue and over the leadership of the Tory party. And let me tell you just a little bit about his remarkable and diverse career, so you will know, if you don't already know, how lucky we are to have him with us today. Born in Hong Kong to a British diplomatic family, Mr. Stewart grew up in Malaysia and in Scotland. And after graduating from Oxford, he served as an infantry officer before joining the British Diplomatic Corps. He served in Indonesia, and I understand before the age of 30, became the British representative to Montenegro following the Kosovo campaign. Later, he was a deputy governor for the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. And during his many sojourns abroad, including that one, he has written vivid, funny, memorable books, beginning with The Places in Between, which is a book about his trek on foot across Afghanistan in the company of only Babur, a dog that he picked up along the way. Delightful book. I recommend it to you all, but we're even more delighted that Rory Stewart has made the trek to Yale today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, firstly, thank you very, very much indeed for coming. Are you able to hear me clearly? I have a microphone on, which should make it audible. I've taken rather seriously and solemnly the fact that this is a lecture on business ethics, and I'm going to be talking mostly around the theme of business ethics. I'm very comfortable, very happy answering questions afterwards on anything you want to ask me on. If you want to talk about Brexit or Boris, I'm very happy to go in that direction. But I feel that I at least owe the generosity of the Mars family and this very generous lecture to concentrate on the theme with which we begin, which is the theme of business ethics. And in particular, I want to talk about one of the great themes of the modern age, which is the role that the private sector can play in international development. Probably, potentially, the greatest moral cause available to business in the private sector, which is its role in achieving development. And this has become a more and more popular theme through a series of, and these are quite sort of technocratic moments, but through a series of conferences in 2002, in 2012, 2015, which eventually ended up in the grand phrase, which some of you may be familiar with, which is billions into trillions. So the fundamental idea is that the needs of the developing world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which are these goals set out in this multilateral framework, by 2030 involve, on average, an investment of an additional $2.5 trillion a year. Now, obviously, these numbers are, to some extent, plucked out of the air. I mean, the UN statisticians will not be very grateful to me saying this. They've put a lot of effort into trying to generate this figure of $2.5 trillion. But by and large, this is an attempt to put a number on the amount of money you would need in order to fulfill the infrastructure objectives, which would come in at an additional sort of $500 billion a year. The needs on things like water, which would require about $100 billion a year, needs on education and health, which are about the 150 billion level, or the needs in telecommunications, which are at about 300 billion a year, et cetera, et cetera. And to put the problem in context, the total contributions of the domestic expenditure of these countries and the overseas development assistance, in other words, the money that would come from the US government or the World Bank or the IMF or the British government, barely approaches 1.2 trillion a year. So the total amount required is more than double the amount that's already going in. We're barely contributing a third of what would be required to meet this. In fact, it's even more extreme than that. If you look at the British government currently spends 0.7% of our gross national income on international development. It's required by law. That was a target set. We are barely contributing 1/400th of the amount of money that would be required. So myself as Secretary of State for International Development, I felt very smug. I sat in an office. I controlled $20 billion a year of expenditure. That seems like an enormous amount of money to British taxpayers. It is an enormous amount of money. But in terms of finding that additional $2.5 trillion a year, it's not a great deal of money, right? Which leads me to this rather grisly stuff up on the board, right? Now, I have to begin essentially by pointing out that one of the reasons why it's very difficult talking about these subjects, difficult about how you actually translate $2.5 trillion required private sector money into really making lives better in Malawi, lives better in Jordan, lives better in Niger or Chad, right? How do you translate all this chat and all this money into somebody actually completing 7 years of education, a girl completing 7 years of education in Niger? Or how do we actually get clean water to someone in Lake Turkana in Kenya? One of the reasons it's difficult to talk about is that we are trapped in an incredibly abstract world of jargon. And that's what I'm largely indicating on this slide behind me. There is absolutely no requirement to look at this in any detail. This spaghetti bowl that they've created, right, is complete nonsense. If you were to spend any time actually looking seriously at this, what it basically tells you is that there are about 4 different ways of giving money to other people, right? You can give them the money in a grant, you can lend them the money through debt, you can make an equity investment, or you can provide some form of insurance instrument, or you can have a hybrid instrument, which is basically just a way of combining all those things. And on the left-hand side, there are different people who give the money. Right, again, no big surprises. The different people could be a country like the United Kingdom and its aid, could be a multilateral agency like the World Bank, could be a philanthropist, or it could be various forms of private sector investment. Right? Quite why somebody believed that in the OECD that illustrating it in that way would really help you. I'm not quite sure. Right? And then up at the top, you have, those of you who can't read it, you are looking here at the absolute epitome of everything that is wrong in the way that we think about international development. So in the increasingly globalizing interdependent world economy, a holistic approach to the interconnected national, international, and systemic challenges of financing development, sustainable, gender-sensitive, people-centered development in all parts of the globe is essential. Such an approach must open up opportunities for all and help to ensure that resources are created and used effectively, and that strong, accountable institutions are established at all levels. To that end, collective and coherent action is needed in each interrelated area of our agenda, involving all stakeholders in active partnership. Right, okay. Enough of all of that. We're going to take this away, and I try to tell this. So let me just quickly work my way along this whiteboard. Right, the first point is why the private sector in international development. Right? And I've given one answer to begin with, right, which is that we need the money. We need approximately 2.5 trillion a year extra. And that money exists at the moment in places like the City of London. It exists in companies. If you're looking for that kind of money to go into national development, the obvious place to look is the private sector.
Rory, do you have a marker?
Yes, sorry. Here we are. Let me try this. No? Does that work? Or maybe I'll try here. No? How about that? Does that work? We got another one coming. Okay. Another marker inbound. I'll keep talking while the marker comes in. So, first reason, scale, right? You need to go to the private sector to get the money. Second reason why you go to the private sector. The private sector is very good at doing certain kinds of things which really matter to development. So 90% of jobs created in Africa at the moment are created through the private sector. Thank you very much. I'll try these as well. See how this goes. Okay. Look at that. Beautiful. So, number one, the quantum. Number two, the things that the private sector is very good at doing. Jobs. Number three, an assumption that the private sector may, because of various mechanisms, for example, competitive market mechanisms, be slightly better sometimes than development agencies or charities at choosing projects that can be sustained. What do I mean by that? Maybe the profit motive of the private sector means that they look a little bit more closely before they make an investment into a particular business in Kenya at whether there really is a market for those goods. And if they get it right, hopefully, thank you very much indeed. That's very kind. That's lovely. Thank you. Hopefully, if they get that investment right, then the jobs can be sustained into the future, right? So, potentially good investments. Finally, very, very important in this whole narrative about the private sector getting involved in international development is that the recipient countries do not want to feel like they are charity cases. They do not want to feel that they are victims who are just receiving handouts from aid agencies. If you are the president of Kenya or you're the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, you want to feel that you're a partner, that somebody is making a viable business investment. So a lot of the rhetoric coming out of sub-Saharan Africa is about partnering on business investment and employment. But, right, the big but. The big but is that actually this entire process has not really worked. In fact, I would go further. Since we began this process of trying to turn billions into trillions, instead of actually increasing the amount of private sector investment going into developing countries, the amount of private sector investment going into developing countries has fallen very sharply. And between 2017 and 2018, foreign direct investment going into developing countries reduced by 30%. The first trimester of 2018, project-based investment alone dropped by 30%. Now, this has caused a real problem for people. Why is it failing? Yeah. Oh, okay, back to the blue. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's interesting. It's a sort of symbol. I failed and I'm writing about failure. There we are. Right, okay. Now, the model was supposed to be that the way to get private sector investment into developing countries is what? I'm going to open up to the audience to wake you up. Right, what are the kind of things that people think about when they want to think about getting private sector investment into developing countries? What might you do to increase it? Get the billions into trillions. There's all this money sitting in New York and London. You want to get it in what?
You might underwrite the risk of the investment.
Absolutely, right. Okay, that's the first thing. You do a risk guarantee, some form of guarantee mechanism. Something else, yeah.
You might reduce the barriers to doing business in that country.
Quite right, yeah. Okay, you might try to focus on creating an enabling environment for business. Let's get some examples of what you might want in an enabling environment to encourage investment coming into these countries.
Open up foreign markets.
Yep, open up the markets, yep. So we're going to open these markets. What might you encourage the government of that country to do to try to get the investment in? What other things?
Infrastructure.
Yeah, you might get the infrastructure try to get them to invest in infrastructure. So, for example, if you're trying to get somebody to go into Afghanistan in order to exploit the fact Afghanistan has very good fruit, very good apricots, very good peaches, that's not going to work unless you've got roads to get it out and unless you've got some facilities in order to dry or freeze the fruit in order to move it. Otherwise, everything gets bruised on the truck and all your fruit gets ruined. So,
Minimize corruption.
minimize corruption. Corruption, the rule of law. Yep. Security, somebody said. Right, another thing that you often put pressure on governments for is to, yep. Tax regime, very good. Okay. However, notwithstanding attempts to do all this kind of stuff, we actually have this 30% reduction in a single year in the amount of foreign direct investment going in. Now, let me now begin to sketch out. I'm going to try a different color. If it doesn't work, tell me. Not good? No? Okay, all right. Rubbish. Okay. I'll try the black one. Okay.
Want me to try to fiddle with the lights and see if I can give you a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
more
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah,
in
yeah,
here?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, let's try that.
Let's see what we can get here.
Ah,
Is that a little better?
is this a bit more visible?
Is that
But no? All right, I'll stick with blue. Okay.
Try the black too.
It's a blue and black. Okay, very good. Okay, so what are the fundamental problems? Fundamental problems, let's just run through a few of them. Problem number one is a problem, that is not the right pen. Problem number one is a problem of scale. I mean, simply the amount of money that you're talking about trying to move into these countries is inconceivable. I mean, trying to go from billions to trillions is an incredible ask, right? Second problem. Investable projects. So if you take the British Development Finance Organisation, CDC, which was given £4 billion in order to make investments specifically targeted at developing countries, they haven't been able to spend the money. Right? It's very, very difficult for them to find investments at the moment, in Africa in particular, where they're targeted, which actually allows them to put their money in and get any kind of money back. In fact, the more pressure that has been put on CDC to spend that money, the more money they're losing. And that's only 4 billion. We're not talking trillions there. That's actually finding where to put that 4 billion. Right. That's CDC. The third problem is trying to understand context, and in particular politics and conflict. Let me here take an example of Jordan. And I'm taking Jordan quite deliberately because Jordan is not theoretically one of the difficult countries in the world, right? It isn't a place like Chad or Niger, right? Niger at the moment, the fertility rate is about 7 children per family, right? These are countries where poverty is so extreme, the climatic pressures are so extreme, it's very, very difficult to know what to do. Jordan is not one of those countries. Jordan's a middle-income country, right? Jordan is a country where the incomes are not in the hundreds of dollars a year, it's in the thousands of dollars a year, in which literacy rates are up at 90%. But even in somewhere like Jordan, it's very difficult to do things. Let me give you one example of an ideal example of ethical business investment in Jordan. Solar power. Jordan should be the ideal place to put solar power. Actually, it's not just the sunlight, the atmosphere in Jordan, particularly northern Jordan, ideally placed for putting in solar panels. The prices have fallen very dramatically. Right? A single installation in Jordan, which 4 years ago would have been generating power at 18.5 cents, is now generating at 2.3 cents. Right? It's unbelievably drop in the cost. Right? They're now generating energy in Jordan for a much lower price than they can generate energy from any other source because of the quality of the air and the sunlight. But it is completely impossible to convince anybody to invest in putting in additional solar capacity in Jordan. Why is this? Right? Does anyone want to try to get into what could be the problem here? So we have an ideal proposition. We have beautiful sunlight, a wonderful ethical business proposal, and if we could get it right in Jordan, for goodness sake, we're going to go off to the Sahel, we're going to do it in Niger, we're going to do it in Chad, where there's a lot of sunlight too. And we've been running solar panels all over the world to generate energy. Why isn't it happening? Anybody suggest one problem in Jordan? Sir?
Maybe the government had invested in electric generation facilities or big facilities that cost billions of dollars. I'm still paying them over the next 30 years. They need to sell electricity to the public.
Okay, so this gentleman is 100% right, okay? The government has already made 3 major investments over the last 10 years in burning very, very expensive shale oil and imported LNG. And they already have contracts for that on providing electricity which far exceeds their current demand. And the contracts that they've signed are such that they are compelled to pay $500 million a year to these companies, regardless of whether or not they actually take any electricity from these companies, right? But why did they do that? Why did they get into signing these extraordinary, crazy, diverse contracts 30 years forward on shale oil and gas? Because that also reveals part of the problem in business and development. Why did they sign those contracts? Here's a clue. They signed the contracts just after the Arab Spring in 2011. Okay, the answer is they were dependent on a gas pipeline from Egypt that was blown up 12 times in terrorist attacks in 2011, and they concluded at the beginning of 2012 that they needed to diversify their supply. So they signed these incredibly expensive contracts with Shell and others for shale oil and imported LNG in order to have a diversified supply and not be exposed. Now they're tied in for 25 years. Right. So what is the alternative thing that you might be able to do with all this lovely land where you can generate solar power in Jordan if there isn't a domestic requirement for it? What might you want to do with it? Okay, you can't. There's no domestic demand in Jordan, but you sell it to another country, right? Okay, what's the problem there? What's the problem that Jordan faces selling it to another country? Okay, so they're markets, they've got great markets that actually want that power, right? There's demand in Lebanon, there's demand in Iraq, and there's demand in Turkey for that power. They could sell to all 3 of those countries, but you've got to get it there, and sitting in the middle is Syria. All the transmission lines go straight the way through Syria, so you can't export either. Right. So this is just one example, right? I'm just using Jordan as an example, but you can imagine that if I now move on to what seems on the surface the incredible potential in Africa in particular for the generation of solar power, which theoretically you could cover the whole Sahara Desert in photovoltaic cells. Why is it that that isn't really happening? Why is the billions not being turned into trillions and the generation capacity not being built? Right? The entire additional capacity brought on in Africa over the decade leading up to 2017 was 6,000 megawatts, right? It's tiny amount of additional capacity, 6 gigawatts of capacity. To put that in context, over a decade, they built less than 8% of the current UK generating capacity for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Right? And I'll get into trying to talk through a particular project in Kenya to try to illustrate how this goes wrong. But the point is that there we have an example, even in rather an easy middle-income country like Jordan, let alone Niger or Chad, why you can't really get there. Okay. Next. Sorry. Apologies. There's a real comedy going on with the pens here. You know. Given that my whole talk is about competence and practicality, and I'm completely unable to pick up the right pen, there's some sort of lesson you need to draw here about the gap between rhetoric and reality. So, politics. Okay, it's very, very tempting when we talk about the role of the private sector, the role of business in making ethical investments and addressing some of the great challenges of our time, such as, for example, the challenge of climate change, to imagine that there are lovely, neat financial technical solutions which can be brought to bear. Now, I've talked, of course, about the most extreme cases in the developing world in which conflict and war and instability makes that very, very difficult. But of course, actually, if you bring it closer to home and look at a country like Britain, you actually understand that even in Britain, it's very difficult to get the private sector to go into some of these areas. I'm going to pause on this and just say that if any of these nice people who want, there are lots of seats, and I would like to invite you down. Can you bear to come down? Anybody? Or do you want to slip away? Anybody want to come down? They can come down. There's many, many seats, so if anybody would like to come down. So let's take the example of climate resilience in Britain. Right? Britain is beginning to experience, like many other countries, more and more flooding. And in the recent events in 2014, 2015, we began for the first time to experience unprecedented rainfall, 17 inches of rain, hillsides being washed away, thousands of communities getting flooded. And these were things which the Met Office had said were 1 in 100-year events, which happened twice in a 3-year period. So 2 1 in 100-year events happening twice in a 100-year period, within a 3-year period. Now, the solution, of course, that everybody comes up with, particularly governments that don't like spending money, is let's bring the private sector in to make the nice climate resilient investment. In particular, let's try to address the problem of the government perhaps perpetually having to bail out householders whose houses go underwater by doing what? What's the solution to this? Somebody suggests. What's a good private sector solution to the government having to pay every time somebody gets flooded? An insurance market, right, exactly. So here we are in Britain, very, very stable environment, very good data, no war going on, no conflict. Government leans in to try to work with the insurance industry to do this, negotiates for 5 years, and discovers in the end that the insurance industry is only prepared to provide insurance for the most vulnerable houses if the British government itself writes a cheque of £185 million in a year to the insurance industry to incentivize them to do this. Right? Notwithstanding the logic of the market, which theoretically suggests that if you just got the premiums right, the whole thing should be able to cover itself. Right? In addition, as you begin to get into the detail of the government response to flooding, you begin to realize that these sort of technocratic models, the economic technocratic models which we would try to apply to Jordan or Niger, don't really work when you're working with communities on the ground in Britain, because you begin to realize just how much local politics grinds into the response, that the allocation of money isn't easy, partly because I want to know why you're not dealing with my flooding, and I am not at all satisfied to be told that the reason why you're not doing it is that you have a fair mathematical formula that has calculated that my flood risk and the cost of repairing my house, compared with the risk to people in the Humber, where there are 150,000 people living below sea level and there are a 1 in 25-year risk of being flooded, does not satisfy me at all. Nor am I at all satisfied to hear that I don't deserve the money because I have a 1 in 100-year risk of being flooded when I've actually been flooded twice in 3 years. Right? Nor, and these things become more and more sort of depressing, nor really am I prepared to accept that I should be contributing towards this flood risk in any way. And companies feel this too. So again, another great attempt is to get business to invest. For example, we try to get BMW to pay for the bridge in Oxford going over to their facility on the grounds that they have an interest in getting their workers there, and the flood stopping their workers getting to the factory, and that's going to take money off the bottom line. So surely BMW is going to put in £12.5 million to help pay for the bridge. Well, guess what? BMW has no intention, right, of putting £12.5 million in to pay for the bridge. Right? And then we get into the question of the profit motive. which I'm going to come back to at the end, because we're talking about business here. So probably the smartest thing if you're a Treasury official or an economist and trying to think about water management in any country is to think about a privatized water system. So in Britain, in theory, the whole thing sounds beautiful, right? We privatized our water system in 1982. From 1982 to today, the private sector has invested £28 billion in upgrading water infrastructure. Water quality is 98% better than it was in the early 1980s. Outages are 95% down, and the cost of water in and out of your house is £1 in and £1 out. What a great success, right? It's done much better than the government did, except 85% of the British public is in an absolute boiling rage, right? And wants to get the private sector out of the water industry. Why? Suggest? It's a public good, right? So many of them just feel it's a public good. It's my water. I don't want private sector getting involved. What else is annoying them? Right. What's annoying them is these companies are owned by hedge funds based in New York, right? And they may be providing a service, but they're making extraordinary profits. And nobody wants to be in a situation where a utility of that sort is involved in giving people 20, 30 million pound bonuses and payouts and all this kind of thing. So that the wonderful involvement in the private sector in this philanthropic activity is immediately undermined in terms of legitimacy with the public. Right. Let me now fast forward to solutions, and then we can go into more questions. Okay. How then do we think about the role of business in this great moral project of international development? How do we really envisage what a constructive role could be, notwithstanding all these problems of scale, of investable projects, of context, of conflict, and of politics? The answer, I think, is two things. The first is to make sure that when we think about the private sector investing in international development, we contextualize it within a much broader sphere of diplomatic and developmental activity, which reinforces what the private sector is doing, controls it, regulates it, adjusts it. Let me give you an example of Myanmar, so Burma. Thinking about the private sector in someone like Myanmar is not just about a question of quantums. It's not just about how do we turn billions into trillions? How do we get a lot of private direct investment going into Myanmar? It may be thinking about international relations. In the case of Myanmar, it may be thinking about the relationship between Myanmar and China, and in particular, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and in particular, Chinese involvement in timber logging through militia groups. It may be about the Chinese construction of a port on the coast. It may be about China making soft loans to Myanmar, and the way in which the international community can help to advise the Burmese government and navigate those relationships with the Chinese government, right? So we're not just talking about business on its own, we're talking about business, in that case, wrapped in diplomacy. Secondly, we may not just be talking about business in Myanmar, we may also be talking about business wrapped in technical revenue advice. Right? So probably the smartest single investment made by the World Bank in Myanmar 3.5 years ago was an investment in the Revenue Authority, which increased the tax take of the country from about 11% to 12% of its GDP. Right, that was an investment by the World Bank of something in the region of $10 to $15 million and a bunch of tax advisors and consultants, which generated about $1.5 billion a year for the government of Myanmar. Right. Next, it may be about certification. So one of the great potentials of Myanmar is, of course, in its natural resources. It's timber, it's gemstones, it's rubies, it's emeralds, right? But these are currently controlled generally by insurgent groups, gangsters, illegal activities. To really get that timber to the European markets, to get those emeralds into Tiffany's, one of the most useful things that you can do is not simply to say, okay, here is the private sector, but think about what would be involved in some form of certification. When it comes to tourism income in Myanmar, it may be about thinking about environment, in particular on the Irrawaddy. There's a lot of fishing going on, with dynamite at the moment. But the Irrawaddy is home to the Irrawaddy river dolphin. The Irrawaddy river dolphin is an extraordinary thing where you must go and see it. That's doing my part for Myanmar tourism, right? When you go out with a fisherman with the Irrawaddy river dolphin indicates which direction the fisherman is to throw the net. And you can see it sticking its head up, and when the fisherman throws in the wrong way, shaking its head in the other direction and generally getting infuriated with the fisherman, right? These amazing creatures, which are actually almost unique in the world, are of course under enormous threat from overfishing along the Irrawaddy. A proper response to that could both increase, obviously, the tourism income, but it involves a very smart approach to the fishing industry in Irrawaddy and a very thoughtful approach to regulation. And of course, all of this needs to be surrounded by some much more traditional development projects, which the private sector isn't going to get involved in. So, for example, you might want in Myanmar to do cash transfer programs to women. In other words, you might want to simply give $25 a month to some of the poorest women in Myanmar because they are likely to spend it on nutrition for their children. You might want to employ community health workers in order to ensure that people are taking their tuberculosis pills. Right? These are not things that the private sector is likely to do on its own. And a lot of this is about realizing that in thinking about business and international development, we are not simply thinking about economic growth. So the question of whether Myanmar grows next year by 5% or 5.5% or 4.5% is not really within our gift as an international development community, right? Any more than really when we talk about China's growth from 1980 to 2010, we really were in a position to control whether China grew at 8%, 6%, 7%. And that extraordinary achievement in China of dragging hundreds of millions of people out of poverty wasn't really an achievement driven by the World Bank or international development experts at all. However, had we looked at China from 1980 and said, is there a way of thinking about the way in which this growth might occur, which did not involve the cutting down of their lowland forests, the air pollution in Beijing, the destruction of the Yangtze River, the elimination of traditional communities, the loss of cultural heritage, then you might begin to get into a more interesting conversation, potentially not in China, because the scale of China and the cultural issues that would have been involved in that conversation, but potentially in somewhere like Myanmar, about a path of development which is more sustainable, which includes more elements than simply the elimination of extreme poverty. And that brings me to my final point, which is the question of the measurement of impact. So really what I'm getting to here is to say that what we are not likely to get out of private sector investment between now and 2030 is that great quantity, are those trillions. But that maybe what we need to be thinking about is not the quantity, but the quality of that investment. And we need to start looking much more closely at the different forms of investment made, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa by these companies, and working out how we can measure the social impact of that investment and the relationship between that investment and the sustainable development goals that we are pursuing, and realize just how tricky that measurement is. So, for example, right, I could be a company that is running care homes. That's doing a very good thing. It's looking after elderly people. But I could be paying the workers in my care homes a very, very low wage, right? It's a bad thing. I could be a company, Shell, BP, that is producing an enormous amount of carbon dioxide and having a huge damage on the climate. But I could also be paying a huge amount of taxation revenue to the government of Senegal, which is then being used to pay for health and education in that country. We need to be very careful when we look at these companies on what they're choosing to report. right? So you get in the details. So let's say the company is saying, we are very proud about the fact that we have reduced by 50% the amount of megaliters of water that we are extracting in our process of creating T-shirts, right? Okay, this is only really a relevant fact if there is genuine water stress in that country, or at least it's a much more relevant fact if there is genuine water stress in that country than if there isn't genuine water stress in that country. And so on and so forth. Because we're also going to get into incommensurable issues, right? How do you weigh up, when you talk about an ethical, sustainable investment, somebody emitting carbon against somebody using child labor against somebody polluting a river, right? These are three quite different forms of crime. They can't be weighed on a single scale. An enormous amount of energy is now trying to go in to guide the way in which we as governments, we as the public, can work with companies to make these ethical investments. But we need to understand that it really depends, again, how we engage with these companies. Are we engaging with them as consumers? Or in other words, we're making a choice not to buy this particular T-shirt because of the pollution in the river? Are we engaging as investors? And if we're engaging as investors, what kind of investor are we? Right? Are we an investor who's simply putting short-term money in and out, or are we taking an equity stake in this company, which gives us a very different relationship to this kind of business? Put all of this together, we come back to an idea that in thinking about international development, we need to change our model. We need to get out of the idea that there is this date called 2030, there is this thing, billions into trillions, that there is this magic entity called the private sector, right? Private finance, which is going to come in, turn billions into trillions, and suddenly achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and instead get ourselves into a model which is much more about partnership, and a much more complex, nuanced partnership of the sort that I was gesturing towards in terms of this example in Myanmar. Right? A partnership that could be happening at a whole series of different dimensions, and which, above all, needs to be driven by the values and the pride of the people in that country, right? It's extremely important to understand that this investment in the Irrawaddy River dolphin should not be my caring about the Irrawaddy River dolphin, but being confident in the fact that Burmese citizens themselves take pride in the fact that they have a unique species in their country, that they themselves have an interest in protecting the teak forest, that they themselves have an interest in air pollution, that they themselves do not want polluted water, that they themselves want to try to think about child labor, and finding in that partnership of values a way of thinking about international development that is not simply about money, that is not simply about incomes, that is not simply about dragging people out of extreme poverty, but is about a much broader conversation about the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of society we want to create. Above all, a vision of international development that is about what Aristotle called eudaimonia. In other words, being well and doing well in being well. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I promised that if you want to ask me about Brexit or anything you want, I'm happy to talk about anything you want. I just thought I should talk about business ethics because that was the nature of the lecture. But yeah, I'm very happy to answer anything. Yeah, thank you.
You could field your own questions, but I just want to give everyone notice now that we have a reception following the talk at the Provost's house right across Hill House. So please stay and come over with us. And if it's all right with you, then we have about half an hour for questions.
Right. I'm going to start on the top right.
Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Yep. Coming up there. Yep.
Can you raise your hand?
Rory, could you compare, juxtapose the ethical dimensions of your presentation versus the China One Belt, One Road initiative?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So the China One Belt, One Road initiative is an extraordinary thing. I mean, it's extraordinary firstly in terms of scale. So if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative investment in Pakistan, the British Development Agency, Pakistan is its largest single recipient. But the British Development Agency means by that they're putting $600 million a year into Pakistan. The Chinese Belt and Road offer to Pakistan is valued at $42 billion, right? I mean, it's a completely different quantum of involvement. It has incredible implications for climate, so that currently China has about 500 gigawatts of installed coal-fired generating capacity. But under the Belt and Road Initiative, there is a proposal already for nearly 300 gigawatts of additional coal-fired power for Chinese consumers powered along the Belt and Road. And many of these investments, particularly in relation to places like Myanmar, put the governments concerned in an extremely uncomfortable position, because almost all of this is soft concessional financing, which puts you into a very, very tricky diplomatic and debt relationship with the Chinese government. Now, the opportunity, of course, for us, and I was talking to the WWF 2 days ago about this, is what we could do to partner with the Chinese government to see whether some of these investments could be more environmentally friendly, could be undertaken in a way that was more thoughtful, and indeed there is real demand from China for that. China seems to be very interested in having that kind of conversation. But it's not an easy conversation, because as the British government, you would want to be very careful before you kite-marked the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. If British development money starts going in to try to green the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, you would not have any confidence at all that China couldn't, at a moment's notice, turn around and decide they didn't want to do that, and then you were left having endorsed a project that you would feel very, very exposed on. So I think Belt and Road, actually, right the way from Myanmar through Pakistan to Afghanistan, is probably the biggest single example, and indeed in Africa too, of foreign direct investment flows coming in, and the challenges and opportunities there. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
You mentioned that the majority of British consumers are morally uncomfortable with privatised water in the UK. Do you think that there'd be a similar issue, and if there is, how would it be overcome with the British, for DFID to partner with private water treatment companies providing clean water in Ched and making a profit off it with the help of the British government, as opposed to the more traditional charitable model that has been used so far?
No, it's unbelievably politically difficult, this stuff. So the British government is already in trouble because it's putting... I mean, remember, the money that the British Development Agency is spending is money that is taken forcibly in taxation from British citizens. So effectively, you're taking, £45 from your mother, right? And then you're taking that money, and we're already in trouble because we're spending it on helping to subsidize private schools in Kenya, for example, right? Now, the argument for that is that these are low-cost private schools. They provide a very high-quality education, and they're rolled out very quickly. And if your objective is to get as many children educated as quickly as possible, then you accept low-cost private education. But people are already pretty uncomfortable at the idea that we're putting taxpayers' money into that. Take it to the next level. When you start talking about blended finance, right? When I was Secretary of State for International Development, my department was already talking about DFID putting money into listed companies on the stock exchange, right? Putting our own risk capital in to create these investment vehicles that were then going to invest in Africa. The argument being that the money available for the investment in Africa, it's a way of managing risk. So let's say they have 100 million and we put in 50 million. We take the first tranche of risk, which allows them to spend their 100 million more cheerfully. Now, I personally vetoed this project because I thought the British public were going to go completely bananas if we start taking their money and betting it on the London Stock Exchange, right? But sometimes we have to do this. Let me give you a counterexample in the other direction. One of the great achievements in Kenya in the last 3 years is the building of 365 wind turbines near Lake Turkana. Fantastic place to build wind turbine generation. ideal constant wind speeds of 12 to 14 miles per hour, the largest single assembly of wind turbines, already generating at night nearly 30% of Kenya's electricity needs. But the closer you get to the project, the more uncomfortable you feel, and yet you still should be doing it. And this is the tricky thing here. Right? When you stand in Lake Turkana on the cliff with the guy that's made that investment, and he says to you, how's it working? And he says, yeah, well, I mean, this year we're going to make probably $120 million worth of profit off this. Right? Right? You think that's absolutely terrible. Right? We're putting concessional loans into building these wind turbines. This guy's making $120 million worth of profit. Right? But then he says, yeah, but you've got to understand that this was a very risky proposition. And that for the last 3 years, we've made no money at all because the Kenyan government didn't build the transmission lines in the way that we wanted. So we were having to pay for all our staff and all our wind turbines and all our generation capacity. So we were losing $40 million a year over the last 3 years. And yes, I got lucky this year because they finally built the generation capacity. But then I've got all this debt that I've got to pay off. So in the end, I'm only taking home $10 million a year into my own pocket, right? Now, only this guy, probably, or only someone like this guy, was likely to get that project off the ground. He had to essentially build a road all the way from Mombasa to Lake Turkana. He put himself in the middle of nowhere, one of the most desolate desert landscapes in northern Kenya. He had to design a new type of wind turbine, special short wind turbine, to get round 73 roundabouts between Mombasa and this place. He had to build roads going all the way up the coast. Nobody had ever built anything else. I had to put up with the risk of the Kenyan government and paying the landowners. In order to get it done, he personally sent out 25 people to negotiate with every landowner between Turkana and Nairobi to get permission to put the transmission lines across their land. He negotiated the contracts of how much he needed to pay each one of those people. He put in a bit of paper, he took it to the Kenyan government. He said, for $23 million, you can buy out every landowner between here and Nairobi. This is the map, this is how you do it, this is the contract with every one of them. And the Kenyan government then took that, sat on it for 2 years, and then paid out $75 million instead because they wanted to give out more to their friends, right? So nobody from the DFIs, nobody from CDC, nobody from the IFIs, nobody from the World Bank wanted to make this investment in wind turbines. Right? All they could see was the political risk. All they could see was the horror. Turbines would never have been built unless this guy was prepared to drive it through. So we have to defend that. But it's not an easy thing to defend when you're standing up there on the cliff and you're hearing that he's going to put $10 million in his pocket. Yeah. Right. Sir, yeah.
What are your thoughts about infrastructure banks and social impact bonds, financing and the interaction between the two?
Okay, so let's start with infrastructure banks. So, and actually, this Kenya project is quite a good route into this. This individual tried to borrow money from the major infrastructure banks. So he tried to borrow from the IFC, which is the World Bank Infrastructure Bank. He tried to borrow from CDC, which is the British equivalent. He tried to borrow from the Dutch equivalent. So these are banks which, for those of you who don't understand them, they're given public money. And they are supposed to be able to take risk that a normal bank can't take. And they're supposed to accept lower interest rates. And they're supposed to, and as a result, by taking more risk and accepting lower interest rates, they're meant to get projects off the ground that couldn't be funded by the private sector. But consistently, what seems to happen is that actually these banks are so risk averse. So in the case of that particular investment in Kenya, they were demanding that the risk was wrapped and rewrapped at a cost of an additional 20% to the project. They were charging interest rates, real interest rates of about 11.5% to him, that he actually financed the entire thing out of the private sector and didn't touch a single one of these development finance institutions to get the whole thing off the ground. So there is a real problem, actually, even when these things are being funded, of getting the money out of these development finance institutions into these kind of projects. I'm going to give another example, right? The other problem that they face, because they're spending public money, is they face huge fiduciary risks. So CDC invested in a oil palm plantation Feronia in Central Democratic Republic of the Congo, employing 27,000 people in central DRC. But from the moment they made that investment, which took them nearly 4 years to make the investment, and it's 200 miles up the Congo River, and it's a very, very difficult place to access, they are being assaulted in Parliament day in, day out, because investigative journalists have discovered that the workers in that palm oil factory are complaining that they're not being paid enough, and there's a huge amount of problem with the land rights, and how exactly Feronia got hold of the palm oil plantations, and who the previous landowners were. And CDC isn't able to shrug that off in the way that a private investor can shrug that off, because this is public money that they're spending in this way. So I think there is potential in these instruments, and I think there's potential also in social impact bonds. But often when the rubber hits the road, partly because they're spending public money, they often end up having their hands tied behind their backs in ways that makes it actually very difficult practically for them to make the investments on the ground. Sir, yeah.
I was just wondering how you reconcile your own reporting of the poverty in your constituency with your support of austerity for the last 9 years.
Okay, all right. It's a very, very difficult question. Okay, so for those who didn't hear the question, yeah. Question was, how do I reconcile reporting of poverty in my constituency?
Your own reporting, the holding up pants for Twain, I believe it was.
Okay, my own reporting of poverty in my constituency, and he's produced a quote here about my saying that some of my constituents hold their trousers up with twine against the government's record on austerity. So I suppose there are two questions. I mean, is this a sincere question that you want an answer to, or is it a political point that you're making?
No.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, so the sincere answer to that is that my comment about constituents holding their trousers up with twine, some of my constituents hold their trousers up with twine. I mean, that's simply a fact, right? And if you've spent time in Cumbria, you will have met many farmers who hold their trousers up with twine. That's not a secret. It's very common. I myself hold my trousers up with twine. Okay, right? Okay. On the bigger question of poverty indicators in the constituency, so my constituency is a rural constituency. The average incomes in my constituency are about £16,000 a year, right? Which puts nearly 60% of my constituents within the national definitions of poverty, right? That's in relation to the median income. At the same time, unemployment rates in my constituency are the 10th lowest in the country. So out of the entire constituency, there are currently approximately 54 people on long-term unemployment benefit out of the entire constituency. Right? So it's a very, very unusually structured place. You know, very low incomes, very high employment, a very, very high number of self-employed people, so nearly 29% of my constituents are self-employed. 92% work for businesses employing less than 10. By contrast, the west of Cumbria, right, so the area around Sellafield, has higher incomes on average, lower poverty reporting, but much, much higher unemployment, much higher issues with addiction, much more serious issues with addiction, much more serious issues with family breakdown, which is why I think that my conclusion in Britain is that the indicators that really matter are not primarily median income indicators. So Hartlepool, for example, where I was 3 weeks ago, you are looking at communities near Hartlepool, Easington, for example, where essentially the entire community in Easington is unemployed, where people are, the whole southern half of Easington, house after house, are people who are heroin addicts. You are looking at, I was with a family in Hartlepool where I discovered the 12-year-old child had been killed by a car 2 months earlier, where the woman's latest grandson had died prematurely, where the third granddaughter had been born deaf. This is partly related to the fact that they're smoking a lot. The man that I was with was drinking 12 bottles, 3-liter bottles of cider a day. I mean, a kind of phenomenal amount. There are serious mental health issues, huge addiction issues, and there the biggest problem is not universal credit. He's not on universal credit. He's on disability benefit. The biggest issues are cuts to mental health treatment, to addiction treatment, to youth workers. So from my point of view, the damage of austerity is not on median poverty. The damage of austerity is generally on the support services. And if I was spending money, I wouldn't be directing it in the first instance towards my constituency. I would be directing it towards communities such as that community in Easington. Right. Yeah. Sir, at the back, yeah.
My question is, where does the United Kingdom stand regarding the One Belt One Road project joining the and another thing about the funding of the project. One Belt Road Initiative project. They finance it through the ADB, Asian Development Bank, and the New Development Bank. So how is it different than financing from the World Bank and the other private institutions? So there are two questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think your second point is absolutely right. When these One Belt, One Road initiatives are financed by the Asian Development Bank, it's absolutely no difference from the thing being financed by the World Bank. I mean, the difference in the One Belt, One Road initiatives, of course, is that they're often very direct Chinese concessional financing. There's often very direct Chinese companies involved, Chinese labor involved. So one of the issues, if you're Myanmar looking at a port, is how much benefit actually is Burma really going to derive from this project? Or is this simply a fully Chinese-controlled, owned, managed, constructed enterprise where the benefit seems to accrue more directly to China? Let me take two questions together. One, two, yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in your conception of ethics. I mean, at the start of your talk was kind of critique of technological rationality, that kind of spider diagram, and then you end on the Greek word eudaimonia. And I noticed that in the UK in the summer, you're talking about, like, when you were standing as the leadership candidate, it was almost like a talk on Aristotle's ethics. It was prudence and these kind of things. I mean, is that kind of your political philosophy? Are you kind of wanting to invent some sort of virtuous conservatism as opposed to Dave Cameron's compassionate conservatism?
Okay. Well, yes is the answer. So I think that, I mean, this is moving well beyond a Mars lecture on business and international development. But yeah, I mean, if I try to take seriously that question for a moment, I think Aristotle's framework for thinking about ethics and politics seems to me a very, very useful way of trying to think about what it means to engage with the world and change the world in a whole series of different ways. But the first thing that I think is most striking about Aristotle's insight is the connection between practical wisdom, courage, and reality, right? And this is relevant if you want to think about Donald Trump, or you want to think about Boris, or indeed if you want to think about people on the left as well as the right, okay? The point being this, that what Aristotle points out is that for him, courage is the intermediate point between foolhardiness and cowardice. And it is the intermediate point because what makes somebody foolhardy is that they're living in a fairy story world. They don't actually understand reality. Superficially, the brave person and the foolhardy person seem similar, right? They're both risking pain, they're both risking their lives. But the foolhardy person doesn't understand where they are, doesn't understand the risk that they're running, right? Is making no attempt to adjust to the conditions. So to put it in very direct military terms, The foolhardy person is walking directly across the field to the machine gun. The courageous person is working their way along the hedgerow and trying to avoid being shot by the machine gun, still trying to get across the field, but they're more likely to make it across the field. Now, why is this important? This is important because if ethics, moral action in politics derives from reality, we can demand of Boris or of Donald Trump that they describe reality, that they do not offer fairy stories, that it's not good enough to avoid the question how. I mean, the interesting thing in politics in the United States and in Britain, indeed for almost all successful politicians in both countries, is that nobody talks about how, right? All the money goes to the person who sounds boldest, most radical, most optimistic, right? It's as though in your domestic life, I was sitting with you and I was saying, next year, we're going to move to Mauritius and we're going to buy a $20 million house and we're going to live there for 10 years, right? And you're going to say to me, how, right? You're out of your mind. How are you going to do this? You can't do this. It's ridiculous, right? But in politics, you say that. Everyone's like, fantastic, right? This guy knows where he's going. He's got a great, bold vision, right? Okay. Now, in the nature of contemporary politics, and this is as true for some of the current candidates of the Democratic Party, it's as true of Jeremy Corbyn as it is of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, right? People are really reveling in the ability to create these kinds of fairy stories. It somehow, at least they know what they want, at least they know what they stand for, at least they're confident, at least they're clear, right? And it doesn't seem possible to say that this confidence and clarity is like me saying, I'm going to Mars. And everyone's like, fantastic. He's confident, he's clear, he knows where he's going, right? Nobody's able to say, he can't get to Mars, right? So I think that part of Aristotle is really important, but there's more to it than that, right? Which is that the Aristotelian framework is effectively saying that there is no grand theory to this, right? That this isn't about jargon. This isn't about grand statements about equality or sustainability or, to challenge you, poverty, right? It's not about just putting up a word. It's about the exact. You know, the reason why when you ask me about poverty, I want to answer you in terms of this place, its incomes, its employment statistics, and this place in Hartlepool, right? Is that the word poverty, removed from context, can convey 2,000 different things to 2,000 different people. It stretches all the way from my constituency to Calcutta, right? From Hartlepool to France. I mean, it doesn't help you really understand what's happening in someone's life. And above all, it doesn't help you understand how to solve it. Right? The only way that you can actually make the world better, change the world, is understand its specificity. And so I think it's that part of Aristotle, the notion of practical wisdom located in a place and a time, you know, what you can do rather than what you ought to do, that's the key to politics.
If I may
Yep.
address the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Is the current resident at 10 Downing Street going to ignore the law that the most recent law that has passed both houses and make the UK pass out of the EU?
I don't think he's going to, I mean, well, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I've just, I voted against the no-deal Brexit. I've now been thrown out of the Conservative Party. I've effectively lost my job. So I've made this bet that what I did was worthwhile, right? I'm assuming that I have successfully prevented a no-deal Brexit and that we will have an extension through to January. I mean, goodness knows what we're going to do with the extension through to January, but at least we've avoided a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. He's saying that he will ignore this. But I think we have many, many ways round. We can directly go from Parliament to Europe. We can instruct an ambassador. We can instruct a cabinet secretary. My expectation is he will sulk. He will refuse to do it. Nevertheless, the request will be made, the extension will be granted, and then he will try to go into an election saying, it was over my dead body, I didn't want it to happen, people against the Parliament, and try to win a majority for a no-deal Brexit, arguing that he was frustrated by us. But I don't think we will crash out on the 31st of October. I think you'll find it very difficult to do that. Yeah.
So you mentioned some undesirable collateral costs of an investment program. So to kind of flip it, when you're kind of putting together this sort of package from all these different directions, what I sometimes think about is the sort of, to me, rather undesirable influence of effective altruism as a kind of influence that steers things towards what's going to get the best ROI, rather than the areas that have the most need but wouldn't be as effective. And so what I'm wondering is what kind of indexes, like collective utility or whatever it is, that can help steer policies towards where the need is most, rather than what somebody thinks is most effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really, really good challenge, and I don't have an easy answer to that. But I think your fundamental observation must be right. I mean, in the end, the private sector is motivated primarily by profit. And there is always likely to be a gap between the objectives of the private sector and the sustainable development objectives that you have in a particular country. And I think there is a danger always implicit in imagining that you can achieve your ethical objective through convincing the company instrumentally that they're going to make more money by behaving ethically. Because it's always available to that individual to then turn around and say, well, actually, thank you very much for that lovely suggestion that I'm going to make more money by acting ethically, but I've discovered a lovely way of making money where I don't need to act ethically. So thank you for your lovely advice. And actually, I found that if I chuck all my chemicals into the river, that is actually much, much cheaper than pumping them out into some other place. So I think, and I think in the end, the trick is to try to harness the private sector when it's appropriate to do so. Understand there are some things that the private sector does better than the public sector. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, if you look at the Special Inspector General of Afghanistan's report on the USAID program on trying to create private sector jobs, the development agency spent $163 million, I think, trying to create jobs in Afghanistan. Right? So it's a government agency trying to do it. At the end of the whole process, SIGAR concludes that they may have created 6 jobs, but they're unable to actually validate if even those 6 jobs exist. Right? Now, the private sector, generally, in making an investment, is more likely than the government to try to check that there really is a market for the goods they're producing, that the jobs they're creating may actually be sustained through a viable business. And so I think if you're trying to do something like generate employment, right, I think it makes sense to believe that most of the jobs that are going to be created in Africa are likely to be created through the private sector. But if what you're trying to do is talk about values that go beyond the generation of employment, then I think the private sector needs to be balanced by a whole series of other types of investments, regulations, constraints. Yeah.
My question's about Parliament as an institution. I'm wondering what you think about Speaker Bercow's tenure, what you would look for in the next Speaker candidate, and if you have any suggestions for sort of structural changes that Parliament either should look at or should adopt.
Yeah, I mean, so Britain is in a real problem at the moment, as you might have noticed. We are performing a basic public service, which is that I discover that really what we've done for the world is to give the United States an opportunity to feel better about themselves. By it's a real achievement. Everyone's really cheered up. They're like, oh, that's great. We thought we were the worst, right? One of the biggest problems that we face is in relation to our Constitution. So, I mean, of course, every system depends on unwritten rules and codes of conduct and ways of behaving, but in Britain it's even more extreme. Things are so uncodified that the Prime Minister is currently doing things, and the Speaker of the House of Commons are currently doing things that have never been tried before, that were always theoretically possible, but nobody considered doing them. And just to give some very quick examples. The Prime Minister I mean, getting rid of me and 21 of my colleagues is completely unprecedented. I mean, essentially what he's saying is that if a member of parliament votes once against the executive, that's it, they've lost their job. I mean, it will be like Trump suggesting that if a single Republican congressman voted in a single vote in Congress against him, he would attempt to engineer from the center their deselection from whichever congressional seat they represented to ensure they could never run again. Right? He has prorogued Parliament in order to try to prevent Parliament stopping a no-deal Brexit. Right? He's suspended the legislature to prevent it from expressing its opinion. Right? But on the other hand, the Speaker is doing similar things. I mean, I voted to do something that was pretty close to being illegal 2 months ago. Right? The way I was able to stop a no-deal Brexit is that the Speaker allowed us to take control of the order paper from the government by changing this SO24 motion, which isn't meant to have a positive motion, allowed to put a positive motion on it, which we've then voted through, to trap him. Right? So the entire system is lurching around. We don't even have rules around a referendum. We don't know what a referendum really is in our country. In the 1970s, when Scotland wanted to vote for devolution, they were required to achieve a supermajority. They weren't allowed to do it on a 50+1 basis. Now suddenly we're running referendums on a 50+1 basis. Now the people campaigning for a second referendum are saying, well, if we do a second referendum on Brexit, instead of the last referendum where only 18-year-olds can vote, 16-year-olds can vote in the next referendum. And in fact, in the Scottish referendum, 16-year-olds were allowed to vote. But in the Brexit referendum, 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. I mean, there's literally the whole thing is just a complete mess of people making it up as they go along, right? So we need a written constitution to protect the people against Parliament and against the executive. I mean, these people are... And the reason for this is that, of course, you can always get a constituency for this. I mean, basically, all that most people seem to care about is the outcome. They don't care about the process at all. Right? So you notice, for example, that that people who voted Remain point out enormous process problems with the referendum. Right? There was dodgy money. There were lies on the side of a bus. It was only an advisory referendum. Anybody who voted Brexit, none of them complain about the process of the referendum whatsoever. Again, anyone who voted Brexit is perfectly comfortable with the prorogation of Parliament. Anybody who, like me, right, wants to stop a no-deal Brexit is enraged by the prorogation of Parliament. But it's a mistake to imagine that's because any of us have any real commitment to the constitutional principles at stake. It's simply that we want to get our way, and the whole thing is kind of me. Shall I wait? So people are egging Boris on. I mean, he's not... if he refuses to accept the Supreme Court ruling, many of his core vote will be like, good on you. Because they voted for him as, I think, or many people voted for him in the way that people may have voted for Trump, which is that he's actually intended to be a sort of hand grenade that they're throwing at the entire system. The idea is that I and other people like me are kind of out-of-touch elite, stuck in this funny little pyramid. We don't really understand the real thing. Government isn't working for people. It's not moving. So what do? You get Jeremy Corbyn or you get Boris and you chuck this hand grenade straight up at the thing. And if you say to people who are voting for him, but who is this guy? I mean, why do you think he's going to be a good prime minister? That's not really the question they're asking themselves. They trust the fact that he's going to be a ruffian. He's going to shake it up. Right? He's going to show these people. He's going to tear up this kind of cozy elite establishment consensus. Yeah. So we need a written constitution. Gentleman up there in the yellow t-shirt, yeah.
Yeah. So if things turn out as you expect and there is an election between the party led by Johnson and the Labour Party led by Corbyn, who would you vote for?
So, I mean, let me finish on this then. So I believe there is a potential to be a Trumpian anti-Trump. I believe there is a viable, for the sake of argument, radical center ground of politics, right? But the only way of thinking about it is to think about it not as a bland midpoint between two extremes, right? This is why the center always fails. Everybody always thinks about the center as though it's a sort of refusal to make a decision. I'm going to splitting the difference. And it becomes very jargon-filled. I mean, actually, a lot of these words, that were on that sheet when I began, all these words like sustainability, accountability, they're classic centrist words because they feel like a sort of bland justification of the status quo. What we have to do is get back from Aristotle to Heraclitus and take the fundamental insight there. And the fundamental insight of Heraclitus is that actually the power of the center ground lies in the tension between the two extremes. So the center ground shouldn't be the midpoint on this stick. It should be instead stringing a string from the top to the bottom and turning it into a bow so that the center point draws right on the tension between right and left. I mean, it might combine some of the inherent energy of the individualism of one, the compassion of the other, the patriotism of the one, the moral project to the other, and draw from that something that actually includes the whole of society. Man, really the problem with these projects of Corbyn or Boris are that they are divisive. Right? People are reveling in us against them. Right? The reason I can't get any compromise on Brexit, despite the fact that a compromise on Brexit is the obvious thing to do, right? People voted for Brexit by a narrow margin, 52-48. Let's have a 52-48 Brexit. Let's look at something between Switzerland and Turkey. Let's remain close to the European Union economically. Let's leave the political institutions, right? Let's get on with it, right? Nobody wants this, right? Everybody's either like, rubbish, no Brexit at all, or they're like, we want the hardest no-deal Brexit. And the problem is that they really do not want to even think about how much they have in common. They don't even want to have a conversation about, because they don't recognize themselves in the other. They love the sense that they're different to these other people. In fact, the entire Brexit debate is bizarre, right? The reason I fail on getting a compromise is I keep suggesting that it's about a technical discussion about what kind of tariff levels you want or what kind of relationship you want in the European Union. It's not that at all. Right? You've got one side saying, make Britain great again, and you've got another side saying, the Brexit voters are ignorant, racist, nationalists, and we shouldn't listen to them. In other words, one side is making some comment about Britain, another side is making a comment about the Brexit voters, but neither of them are making any comment whatsoever about what a practical relationship with the European Union might be. So it's almost impossible to get any kind of compromise going again. So to return, right, I'm not voting for either of these people. Right? I am trying to pull back towards this. And what I like about this is it's an attempt to include the entire community of our nation rather than split one against the other and find that energy by combining it and from the tension between the two. Thank you all very much indeed, and good night. Thank you.